Something going on.
So my meetings are that I host are only 40 minutes. I'm trying to keep myself accountable by like coming here. Yeah.
Well, I think the accountability, that's good too.
Yeah, I'm not a morning person.
You know, part of the reason, good morning, everyone on Zoom. So we're going to get started here in just a minute, but you know, as so often is the case, we have a little conversation going on here because I have people live in my classroom again this morning. It's very exciting. Amber's here, Jocelyn's here, and Doug is here. So, and I've got Jody and Autumn both on Zoom. So welcome to everyone. And then all of you that are joining later on Facebook as well, when this is uploaded to Facebook. But the accountability part, we were just talking about the benefits of being in person versus Zoom. You know, Zoom is a wonderful thing. There are times that I join meetings in Zoom because it's easier and better than missing a meeting. However, the accountability being here, and then I also wanted to point out, it's probably been mentioned to all of you before, but one of the, and I've got someone else joining us here this morning, and Laura's coming in. One of the reasons why we have you know, contracts class starting at 9 o'clock on Mondays and Wednesdays, 2 weeks out of the month, and the launch training that now it's the 3/12/36. Am I saying that in the right order?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, anyway, Ignite, all of those things starting at 9 o'clock, and we have something for you almost every day, something that you could tap into. And part of the reason that we do that is because you need to start treating this like a business, right? And if you had a job, a regular job, what we talk about, there's real jobs out there in the world. You'd have to be somewhere at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning and doing what you were supposed to be doing. So we're trying to get those muscles built in you, being productive and active, because you're, the really nice thing about being self-employed, which you are here, an entrepreneur, you own your business, you own your own business. Nice thing about that is that you get to set your own hours, and you don't answer to anybody else, and all of that. But then the drawbacks on that is that you get to set your own hours and you don't answer to anybody else, right? I hope that you all have someone accountable, that you're accountable to, and I am a very, very strong proponent of accountability partners, whether it's just one other person or a group of people. And Launch kind of does that for you too. Everyone's here. You may be a few weeks apart in what you're doing when you started, but you're all here basically on the same level and trying out all the same things at the same time. So, all right. So now it's Linda's little lecture about Launch. We're done with that. All right, we'll move on. So this is where are we? We are July 31st. Oh my gosh, can you, actually, I know people, and I talk about it all the time too, that time passes so quickly, but July has seemed plenty long to me. All right, I'm getting some concurrence there. So, but here we.
Yeah, it does.
Oh, and Olgie's.
Got the teachers that are like, no, it's fine.
Exactly. And Olgie's here this morning too, and Olgie's got her name on it for us today. All right, I knew who she was, although I was recognizing the phone number too. So, so we're in the second Wednesday of the contracts class, of the scheduled contracts classes. And so this week, on Monday, we went over the form that we have for you, even though it's hard to find in our files, the ready to make an offer. And so all of the things that you get prepared when you're ready to sit down to write an offer with the buyer, having gone through the property with them, having your entire buyer folder already ready to go, the buyer agency and all of the tangential forms with that. See, it's Wednesday, and I've got to start teaching again next week. So, bear with me a little bit. And so having your whole file together, folder together in Dotloop, and then we started in on the contract. We were actually on, I think we finished page 2 was my memory. And had we just finished page 1?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right, because we hadn't talked about, yeah, you're right. Ready to start page 2. So thank you.
Sure.
All right. And I'm going to share here in our classroom. So anyone there on Zoom, let me know. I am now on the sharing page here, and I hope you see it. And it says for training purposes here. I am using the contract. I wasn't on Monday, but nothing changed on the first page. So I am using the form that will become live and active for us to start using in the KCRAR templates as of August 14th. If you've been paying attention to the dates in the settlement and all of the changes that had to be made at that, because of that, the 17th was the drop dead date where all of the changes had to be made, but that's a Saturday. So KCRAR and MLS decided, hey, let's roll out the forms a little earlier so that there will be some availability of staff if, and I'm gonna try to get that out of my way. There we go. No, you won't have access to the forms until the 14th.
Okay.
I can send these to you. The training forms, the new ones. Yeah, if you get onto their website, they have their forms available, always have, always will. But we're talking about the new change forms, and they will, because they don't want us using them, right? So, and so the ones I have will have training written all over them, you know, in the background here for training purposes only. And, but I can, and I was given permission yesterday that we can start using these for training purposes. So I'm happy to send these out. There's not, and Jocelyn, there's not a lot of difference between our new forms and the old ones. I'm going to point those out. For most of you, I'm going to guess, you'll be, the first time you write a contract, you'll be using these as of the 14th, right? But let me know if anything comes up for you, because Doug was sharing with me this morning that he's got a buyer, he thinks he has a buyer client, right? Coming on, so yeah. And you know, that's what we hope for all of you. All right, so yeah, page 1 didn't change at all for our purposes here, but we did get through the list. I remember we did talk about the list. All right. Yeah, you're right. Laura, thanks for reminding me. I would have gotten there, but thanks oh yeah, and again, also for those of you, another benefit of being in person is that Kristen brought some treats in, so feel free. I guess their neighbors brought them over to her to them last night. So, all right, so page 2 of our contract. Electronic systems and components. Upon closing, seller agrees to reset to factory settings or provide codes and passwords for all electronic systems or components at the property, including those components controlled remotely. So here we're talking about the Nest systems, the Blink systems, you know, all of those kinds of things. I can't even come up with all of the names of things, but there are smart systems that connect everything in some houses. The seller can take those with them, but if they are leaving them, we need access to them, or the new owner needs access to them. All right, so I'm going to reference back. So yesterday when I was talking, I said we weren't going to talk about that because it didn't make sense until we got there. Back on page 1, lines 40 and 41, unless modified by the seller's disclosure and or additional inclusions and the exclusions, all existing improvements on the property, if any, and appurtenances, fixtures, and equipment stay with the property. So remember, yesterday we talked about, regardless of what's in MLS, doesn't matter. That's marketing material, right? That for this purpose. What the seller's disclosure says is what governs our agreement, unless it is changed in the contract. And so then on page 2, the additional inclusions and exclusions paragraphs 1B and 1C on lines 56 and 65. Additional inclusions. The following items, if any, supersede the seller's disclosure in the pre-printed list before are considered to be part of the property and are included in the sale. This is where we would put that refrigerator if the buyer really wants it. The washer and dryer if the buyer really wants it. I'm hesitant to even put those in there, but those are the most common ones that we see. If we start getting into riding lawnmowers and dining room furniture and the entertainment pit, nope, absolutely
Sell
not.
Buyers, that will have to be separate.
Separate.
And what does that look like separate?
A bill of sale. It's a separate
Is that something
document.
we would do for them? How
Not
would they do that?
Not supposed to, but of course we do, right? Yeah, because and and there's not one in KCRAR. You need to go out and find one, and there are out there.
Would you just say,
Google
tell
Docs.
them, yeah, have them, that's something they need to do on it.
They really should. Here's the catch-22 in all of this. It is really best to keep the buyer and seller separate throughout the transaction.
Yeah.
Because things might be said, right? Most of the time it'd probably be fine, but I've certainly been in situations and seen situations where it did not turn out fine. Someone said something inadvertently that then the other person took umbrage at. So, or two. So it's best to keep that at a minimum. So then that is why we typically do that. And we don't have one, you'll find one, you know, your team will have one because it's come up, you know, just ask, you know, for a bill of sale and keep that in your your own personal folders and files so that you can pull that up when needed. But I always do have the conversation first, but if they start talking about the riding lawnmower, or whatever, it's like, you know what, let's talk about the house first. And we don't want that to squirrel what's going on with the real estate, and then we will deal with that separate. Right. So, and here we are caught up in that too. I don't know the value of those things. I don't even really truly know the value of a refrigerator, a washer and dryer. So, so then here's the thing. Why do we not want that stuff in our contract? Number one, if it's a loan, if the buyer's getting a loan on that, the lender and the appraiser, neither one want that in the contract. If the appraiser starts seeing a lot of personal property in our contract, they're going to start deducting the value of that. They're going to put a value on those things, right? So does a real estate appraiser know the value of a riding lawnmower? Probably not. So that's why in that situation, then I used to say, so if it was a cash transaction, it's probably less of a big deal. Oh, no. Linda doesn't say that anymore. On a cash transaction, we still want it separate, because now I've seen where, all of that stuff screwed our real estate transaction too. So just needs to be completely separate. All right, so inclusions are things that the seller's disclosure says are not staying that the buyer wants. Exclusions, before I move on from that. So even if we are going to put the refrigerator, a couple of things I would recommend on this, don't just say the refrigerator to remain with property, because then the seller could put any refrigerator in there, right? Right, I would definitely get the model, and if possible, get the serial number of that refrigerator that you want staying there. And even maybe the verbiage as shown in the property. But if you've got the model and serial number there, that should do it. Then we also have to use verbiage along the lines of the refrigerator is being left as a convenience to the seller and has no value. I always have a really difficult time having my seller sign that, because we all know that refrigerator's got a value, and that's why the buyer wants it. But that's what the lender wants. So if you are going to be asking for these things, first I would say talk with your broker, with me, with your coach, whatever, but also talk with the lender and make sure that they're okay with the verbiage too. But you do have to put something in there that indicates that we're not counting this as part of the price of the house. All right. So those are the additional inclusions, things that are indicated on the seller's disclosure are not staying with the property and the buyer wants. Subparagraph C, we have the opposite of that, exclusions. If the seller says, well, we're leaving the refrigerator, washer, and dryer, and the buyer doesn't want those, that's where we would put this. Okay, don't have to put anything about value there, just have to be specific. We are not attorneys. Anyone in here gone to law school? Before I say that, okay, all right. We are not attorneys. Our responsibility, and the only thing that we're allowed to do is fill in blanks on an attorney approved form. This is the one area in which we can use verbiage and don't try to sound like an attorney when you're doing it. But there's a very fine line that we're walking here. We need to be as specific as we can without being too specific on some things. We can't be general, right? That leaves things way open. So it can't be too general, can't be too specific. So make sure that you are getting your verbiage approved by someone else, your broker, your coach, someone on your team or whatever that's been through that. All right, then on line 74, additional terms and conditions, if any. This is kind of lumped in here. This has nothing to do with the seller's disclosure, but it's just kind of lumped in here with all of the stuff. The additional terms and conditions, starting on line 74, is the one and only place that we have in our contract to address something that is not specifically addressed in the contract itself. Typical things that you see here might be something that I mentioned on Monday, because Kristen used to use it on her sample contract, would be there's a dead tree in the back corner of the backyard that the buyer wants the seller to remove. That's where we would put that. We also see this currently, it's not going to apply to the form I'm showing you right now, but for the next 2 weeks, if you're showing a property that indicates that there is no buyer agency compensation being paid, that's where we would put this. That the seller to pay, right? If you run across that situation in the next 2 weeks, talk with your coach about that because we have specific verbiage. Always make sure that you're looking to see if compensation is being paid on that. That's MLS information until the 14th. All right. And we also use this if our buyers in competition with several other offers or even just one other offer, and they want to make theirs more attractive, and so they're willing to pay some of the seller's closing costs. Typically, we think of asking the seller to pay some of the buyers, but we've seen the opposite of that. That's not addressed anywhere in our contract, so that's where we would put this. Anything that we can't address anywhere else or is not addressed anywhere else in the contract is where we put on line 74 additional terms and conditions, if any. If things are blank, then nothing applies. All right. If you leave it blank, you don't have to put NA, you don't have to put anything, right? Okay. All right. Starting, then we're still in paragraph 1, limited home warranty on line 81. We address this in our contract for a couple of reasons here. Whether the buyer is going to ask for a home warranty, either for the seller to pay for it or to pay for it themselves, or not include one in the original purchase. A buyer can always change their mind at any point during the process if they're going to buy it themselves. So this is our one and only time to ask the seller to pay for it. And we put it here in writing for one important reason, actually. Errors and omissions insurance. Errors and omissions insurance is the insurance that covers you if you're sued or something. You will have errors and omissions insurance on you, E&O. I'll start calling it E&O. E&O insurance on you through your broker. Every brokerage has the E&O insurance that covers their salespeople. You will have it on you for all of your transactions, that covers you for all of your transactions. However, there are certain conditions on each transaction that have to be met before your E&O will kick in if you are sued. One of those conditions is that we had the conversation with everyone about the home warranty. So we deal with it on our listing agreement for the seller. We deal with it here in the contract for the buyer. This is our evidence that we had this conversation with the buyer. So please, please, please make sure you had the conversation with the buyer. All right. So on line 83, we have to check one of the two boxes, either on line 83 or 85, that the buyer waives the opportunity for home warranty. As I said, even if they check this box and they decide later on after inspections that they want one they're going to purchase on their own, then they can do that at any point and we can help them through that process. Line 85 would be if the buyer is going to get a home warranty, wants a home warranty in effect as of contract time at a cost not to exceed, and we have to fill this in. Check one, and then we're asking the seller to pay for it or telling the seller that the buyer is going to pay for it themselves. So we have to check one of those two boxes. Agrees to purchase a home warranty plan from, and we have our blank here, has to be filled in. Make sure that, you're pulling them out, aren't you?
am.
Yeah, look at that.
I
Look
get
at that.
organized. No, that's great. I love that.
Trying to figure out how to talk about it, right? If you all go back. In the mailroom, in the copy room, or in the mailroom back there, on the countertops up above there, all of the ones, the home warranty companies that we have affiliated with, and there are even others out there. I don't have any idea how many there are, but so I always, along with the broker disclosure form from both states and a buyer agency agreement, I always have these in my briefcase in the car so that when I'm having this conversation, I can pull all of these out. Again, one of those things, we can't ever tell a buyer or a seller what company to use, right? That's their decision to make, tell them what choices they have. And the reason that I do that, I actually pull them out, is because, sometimes when a seller or a buyer sees something, it's like, oh yeah, we used to have an Old Republic one, or, oh yeah, I've heard of, I know my parents had 1020 for a long time. So it might just kind of spur those kinds of things. Make sure they have plenty of choices on there.
Do you make a buyer and it's package like have already ready, like a buyer and seller packet.
Yes, I do. Yes, Doug asked if I have a buyer and seller packet. Absolutely, I do. I have a printed copy of all of them. When you get proficient in Dotloop, as you are playing in Dotloop, you can make your own templates in Dotloop too, that has all of that stuff that you can just bring over and name it for that buyer.
Okay.
Or that seller, but absolutely, I have printed copies, my buyer's packet and my seller's packet of required documents. Absolutely, good question, all right. Okay, so we have to name the price, we have to name the vendor to be paid at closing. Home warranty plan is a limited service contract covering repair or replacement of the working components of the property for a minimum of 1 year from the closing date, subject to the terms and conditions of the individual plan with a per claim deductible of, and we have another blank there on line 89. That is our service fee, and those can range. So you need to be familiar with the programs because you can pay more for the program with a smaller service fee, or you can pay less for a program. Most of them have kind of a sliding scale. You can pay less for the program with a higher service fee. So you need to be familiar with them. The reps from these companies want to talk to you. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions of them. They want to talk to you. We have a couple that are very involved. Well, we have 3 or 4 that are very involved with what we do here in the office. They sponsor some of our red classes. They sponsor some of the activities that we have. So they want you to come up and talk with them when they're here. So please do that. And then paragraph, or the same paragraph, line 91, the check 1, licensee assisting the seller or licensee assisting the buyer. So if you're asking for one here in the contract, you have to check one of these 2 boxes. I suggest that you check, if you're the one writing the offer on behalf of a buyer, then I suggest that you check the box licensee assisting the buyer. Will be responsible for making arrangements for the home warranty plan, submitting required documentation for such to the closing agent prior to the closing date. Broker may receive a fee from the warranty company. That's kind of gone away. Most of them don't offer us a fee anymore. That's kind of one of those RESPA things that, you know, they tried to, they used to pay us for, you know, sending business their way. I never took it. I always, well, yeah, I mean, I took it, but then I always gave it as a service back to my buyer because I always thought that sounded kind of funky, but it's really, most of them don't anymore because of RESPA. But however, I suggest that you, right, and you know, you all saw me groan here, but that's because I got kicked off of mine.
So,
Start everything
might-
all over
yeah.
here again. No, go ahead.
Kind of better, it's tough. If I'm working with a buyer, I should probably be the one giving it one.
Right, yeah, getting it all set up because exactly. We don't want to be dependent on someone else.
Yeah.
And that if you decide, if you claim that you're going to do it, back on, okay.
Why would you want the seller to do it for that reason? You know what I mean? Like,
But-
it's just.
right,
'cause you're
right.
lazy? I don't know,
The-
like, it just seems like,
Oh, you hit on that word. Yeah.
like, is there an advantage? I mean, there's not really
Nope,
an advantage.
Not at all, not at all.
on the seller.
The only time that might change would be if you know that there's already one in place on the listing. And our
Oh,
listing
I see what you mean.
does tell, right, if they're advertising it that way,
I get
then
that.
we don't really have any control over that.
Yeah.
That is something the listing agent would have to do,
But they're offering.
right?
Every
That might be all.
now and then you might find a nice seller who just puts it in there.
I actually put it on my house and I did it, it didn't sell right away, and then it's like, I'm gonna add that to make it a little more attractive.
Right,
The appliances are a little older, you know, like.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, Laura just hit on, yes. It can be a very effective marketing tool.
I mean, yeah. It's not, it wasn't really used a whole lot though, like, the last couple of years. 'cause
Didn't have to be. Right,
It's
right.
Changing, right? Like it's.
Exactly, yes, Laura's taking, I should
Sorry.
just ask Laura, no, I should just
Maybe
ask you to
I'm
come
not-
up and do, no, I should just ask you to come up and do this for me.
No.
Go sit and drink my coffee. No, Laura's saying all the exact right things. We have not dealt a lot with home warranties over the last few years because there was no need, buyers were waiving inspections and, seller says, oh, I don't have to spend that $800.
Right.
Now, as the market is softening a little bit, it is that they are coming back into our market. It can be a great, great, great marketing tool, especially if the system, and that's what I call, I know it says components here, but I always call it the systems in the house. And, in fact, I'm not gonna write it up here on the board, but Peach, the plumbing, the electrical, the appliances, the cooling and the heating. So it's not insurance, it's a warranty. And so if you know that the HVAC system is old, still working, but old, or if you know that the dishwasher and the stove, are 20 years old, right? That's, I use things in my house until they die and I literally have to, drag them out of the house. But so yeah, it's a great marketing tool. And again, Murphy's Law, if something's going to break, it's going to, break for the buyer within the first 2 weeks that they're living in the house. So, all right. All right, then we get down to paragraph number 2. We're finally in paragraph number 2 on line 97. The following addenda, writers, supplements, etc., are attached here too and are part of the contract, and we check the applicable boxes. So I want to talk about this. On line 100, on the left-hand side, we have our seller's disclosure and condition of property addenda. I think I mentioned this on Monday. 98% of the time, you are going to have a version of the seller's disclosure there. And so you will check this box. If there's not one, make sure you're asking the listing agent, or if you're dealing with a for sale by owner, that's your responsibility to get that to the for sale by owner and ask them to fill it out to the best of their ability. And that's even in our one-time showing agreement, permission to show and commission agreement, is that they will fill one out. There are some situations in which there will not be one. A foreclosed property might not have one. There are some rehabbers, we pretty much convinced rehabbers that they have to do something. So we're not running across that so much anymore, but a lot of times when it's an estate and the kids of the deceased people, well, I never lived in the house, I don't know anything about it, right?
Yeah.
But it's always, 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 all of our questions are worded, are you aware of? And there are things on there that they can fill out. There's a whole paragraph about the utilities, right? Those kids have been paying the utilities, on the property, so they know that. They know what equipment is staying with the property and what's not. So we really need something, but there will be a very rare occasion in which someone refuses to provide a seller's disclosure. Just not checking this box is not good enough. That would be something that we would have to address back up here in subparagraph 1D. That the buyer and seller acknowledge that there is no seller's disclosure on this property. Because not only is it mentioned here, but when we get to page 3, it's mentioned specifically in page 3. It's actually mentioned a couple of times throughout our contract. So since it's dealt with in the contract, we have to say it doesn't apply, right? Can't remove anything from a contract, but that it doesn't apply. On same paragraph on line 101, the second box on the left-hand side, lead-based paint disclosure addendum. When do we need that?
When we initially find buyers.
And
Right.
the addendum will come from the seller. But yeah, you're right, the brochure, when we do our,
Yeah.
for what kinds of property do we need the lead-based paint disclosure?
Houses that we see, or
Built before 1978, very good, yes, exactly. And I like the way that you all are saying that, even though, I mean, legally speaking, you should know that the law says properties built before 1978. I always include 1978. If the property was built in 1978, I always include that too, right? So, all right, on line 102, contingency for sale and or closing addendum. What did anybody here can anyone here tell me what a contingency for the closing sale and or closing of a
the
property
buyers
is?
have to sell their house in order for this contract to be valid.
Very good, right.
This is.
That you receive, did you make an offer or received an offer? Okay, all right. Okay, and it all worked out for you. Is that what? Yeah, okay.
long story short. they did.
Okay, well, yeah, with the contingency, it's always a long story, but all right, so yeah, so Laura once again answered the question that, so what this means is that the buyer wants to buy this property, but has to sell a current property and close on that current property before they have the funds to purchase this property. Once again, over the last few years, we didn't see very many contingencies, but as the market is softening here a little bit, they are coming back in. So you all need to be proficient in how to do that. Backup offers too. I think, that's another one of those things that they have been popular over the last few years, but you all need to be exposed to them. So we will cover that at some point in the next couple of months too. So contingency for sale under closing addendum. There's a whole separate agreement that becomes part of this contract. But it's another document. If that applies, you have to check this box and then deal with that separately as well.
Does the seller also have a contingency,
Such as,
such as that, selling this property, but can't vacate for 120 days because they are also.
sure,
purchasing the
that's a
property.
term. And right, it's not this form that we would use for that. That form is only for the buyer and
Right.
identifying that. But oh, absolutely, all parties can have however many contingencies the other party agrees to.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So, well, okay, we'll get to that. Yeah. Well, actually, before we move on, we will come back up. That would be an additional term and condition. We have to have everything in writing. That's not addressed anywhere else in our contract. So say once again, Amber, what it was you said for the content, because I want them to
Sure.
hear it.
I was just asking if sellers can also have a contingency.
Hmm.
Whether it's they are purchasing a property, but they need 90 days to vacate or whatever the case may be.
Absolutely. So yes, I gave some very basic additional terms and conditions, but right, anything else? So Amber's saying, well, what about when the seller has a contingency? We have sellers that write contingencies on finding a property within the next 2 weeks, or whatever.
That
Or-
the buyer would actually write that in here. If they would have had a conversation with the seller.
Possibly, right? That can be dealt with all kinds of ways, right? So yeah, because when you make that phone call to the listing agent, that might be one of the things they say. Is that, well, yeah, but we haven't looked. We want an opportunity to look, because that's been a real fear of sellers. That's why we're kind of in the position that we are. Well, there are two reasons. Number one, because sellers don't want to give up their 3% interest rates that they've had over over the previous years. But then also because it's been such a tight market, they're afraid that they won't find somewhere to move to. They will be homeless, right? Right. So absolutely. And so when that initial conversation you have with the listing agent, and that could be one of those things. They say, well, we would want a 2-week period to find a property.
I've heard of one too.
Uh-huh.
I heard of somebody that had a contingency on their farm where they asked them, can I leave my cows on there until a certain amount of time?
Uh-huh. Absolutely. Oh, yeah, when you get into when you get into agriculture, you get all kinds of things. Exactly, right. Whether that and because all of this has a value, right? So for a buyer in a very competitive market that has the ability to let the seller take 2 weeks to find a property, or has the ability to let the seller rent back the property for 30 to 60 to 90 days after closing. So absolutely, that has a value to everyone on both sides. So yeah, great questions. Then you'll see that we have a lot of others there. There are so many different kinds of addenda that we could use in here. Some of the more typical ones that we've been seeing, the in its present condition, where the buyer is saying, well, I'm either going to do inspections, but not ask you to do any repairs, or I'm waiving inspections. So the in its present condition, we're not seeing a lot of the appraisal waivers anymore, but that was one too that we would see, where the buyer was going to bring money to make up any appraisal gap that might have happened. We don't have cold weather waivers going on right now, but that's one you will see during the winter time, that we can't test the air conditioning unit or the swimming pool or hot tub because of weather conditions. I know I'm missing some. Also a lot of A lot of brokerages will include their affiliated business and franchise disclosure and the listings and want our buyer to sign them. We have that, but it's all an internal form for us. We don't ask the other side, but it's very common for us to see those coming from other brokerages. So us writing the offer, all of that will be in there. If you're selling a corporate owned property or a bank owned property, there are going to be all kinds of separate addenda for your buyer to be signing. Some of them may be included in the listing. We may be adding them, other ones later on, but anything that's in MLS that looks like it is an agreement between the two parties, right? So again, always check with your broker or your coach if you have questions about, is this part of the contract or is this just informational?
How about we put the lender approval letter on that? Because you have to include it, right?
No, that's thank you for bringing these things up.
I tried to include it, like, he's like, you don't need that. I'm like, "Okay."
Yeah. The pre-approval letter is not part of the contract.
Okay.
In our contract, we say whether we are providing one or not, right? And when we get
Right.
there, it is not required, just like earnest money is not required for a valid contract. But is the seller going to seriously consider the offer if it's not there? Right, so it is not, because the pre-approval letter is not an agreement between the two parties. It's informational only. Yeah, great questions. I love it when people are in person and asking questions. I do, because those are things that people probably wouldn't ask if they were watching on Zoom. Okay, and then again, to point out that the buyer is going to be initialing every page on the bottom right-hand side. Then we get into descriptions and conditions here we're finally on page 3, paragraph number 3. The effective date of our contract is the date of the final acceptance by the last party to sign this contract or any counter offer. I doubt if we'll have time today to talk about counter offers, but someday we will on one of our classes. But if this is not the final agreement, then we will have a counter offer. Whoever signs the counter offer last establishes our effective date. If everyone agrees to the terms in this contract without making any changes at all, the last person to sign and date this document establishes our effective date. Our effective date is very, 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 very important because every other date within the contract is dependent upon our effective date. I'm a paper person, you know, I have folders that have all of this information on the outside of all of my transactions with the buyer's name, seller's name, property address, where they're closing, who the lender is, all that kind of stuff. And I have the effective date right there because now every document that you add to the contract later on, an amendment, another addenda, will all refer to the effective date. So you need to know the effective date.
So even if you get an amendment signed later on in the contract, it still goes by the effective date that you all agreed to in the first place.
Correct, right. Any amendment, it will change a term or add a term to an existing contract. By definition, an amendment changes an existing contract. The reason that I'm saying what I'm saying is because in the header part of it, you have to say, so we have this contract between this buyer and this seller at this address and the effective date of our contract on that. All right, that always asks you for the effective date. But yes, sometimes we're never changing the effective date, but sometimes on those amendments, we're changing some of the dates that depend upon the effective date.
Cannot amendment change the effective date?
Can't change the effective date, it's established, right, by the date of the last signature. Okay. Oh, and here we go. On line 111, the seller's disclosure status. Seller confirms information contained in the seller's disclosure and condition of property addendum is current as the effective date of this contract. Oh, this is underlined, must be important. Seller understands that the law requires disclosure of any material defects known to the seller in the property to prospective buyers, and that failure to do so may result in civil liability for damages. So this is because we talk about the seller's disclosure here, this is why we can't just ignore it if it's not there. We have to acknowledge, both parties have to acknowledge that there's not one. Subparagraph C, the entire, is the agreement that this is the entire agreement, and then we can change it by an amendment as long as the amendment is signed and dated by all parties. I'm going to bring it up here. I'm hesitant to, but I know it comes up. We can change terms on this document as long as it is clear what the change is, as long as all parties initial the change and all parties date the change. Your broker really does not want you to do that. It's a legal and legitimate way of doing it, but it gets really, really, really messy, right? Do everything by an amendment. All right. Okay, because and the reason I bring it up is because other agents will send you things that have been changed. Okay. We just don't want you to. Parties, this is a contract between seller and buyer. Seller or buyer constitutes two or more persons. The term seller or buyer would be construed to read sellers or buyers wherever the sense of the contract requires. Unless identified as seller or buyer, listing broker and any cooperating broker and their agents collectively referred to as broker, and any escrow or closing agent are acting as agents only and are not parties to this contract. Broker assisting buyer shall be an express third-party beneficiary of the provisions of sections 4F1 of this contract and shall have a separate and independent right to enforce such provisions against the seller. That is the first change that we've seen to our contract here for our new contract. That was added. We are not parties to the contract. Our brokerages are not. The closing companies are not, the title companies are not, the lenders are not, no one else is, only the buyer and the seller. We, however, now in our new form, in our new world, have a stake in the contract because possibly our commission is dealt with in the contract. And we'll get to that here probably after our break. All right, so that's our first major change there, that we are not parties to the contract, but beneficiaries of a provision in the contract. Seller and buyer acknowledged broker may have a financial interest in third parties providing specialized services required by this contract, including but not limited to a lender, title company, escrow agent, closing agent, warranty company, wood infestation, mechanical, structural, other inspectors, and repair personnel. Seller and buyer agree broker will not be responsible for the conduct of third parties providing specialized services, whether those services were arranged by the seller, buyer, broker on behalf of either. Even though that paragraph is there. So that's number one, saying, well, we may have a vested interest in a property such as, our brokerage has loans in KC. And using those, we are not responsible for what they do. But even though that's right here and, in plain black and white, do brokers get sued because they recommended or have interest in? Of course they do, all the time. And we are dependent on the judge's mood, right? There is no law about that. There's no written law. That's one of those things, they're common law. It's not statutory law. If the judge just had a real estate deal go sour, guess who they're going to be mad at? So, all right.
So sorry, can I ask a quick question?
Not if you
So-
apologize for it, no.
If, so just kind of, I haven't had a listing or a client just yet or anything like that, but kind of talking about how we don't want to suggest it. Hey, use, so and so. So if we have a client who has a 1970s, 80s, like outdated property, and hey, we're giving them a suggestion to be on the market. Hey, spruce up your property. We can help you stage it. Let's get, maybe do a little painting or this and that. Do you at that point, like as real estate agents, I'm sure that we are going to have lots of contacts for plumbers or electricians and painters or whatnot. Are we allowed to provide them with that information?
Absolutely, Amber. Amber's asking, well, right. And it depends on who you ask, but I will say yes. I will say never give them just one name,
Got it.
though. Always give them three at the
Gotcha.
minimum. And so, yes, yeah, you all, well, Laura's probably heard me say this, but I think one of the very first things you should do, and I think maybe Kristen has started saying this too, that when you are making your phone calls, and introducing yourself, as a new agent and all of that, telling everybody that already knows you, loves you, and trusts you. I think one of the very first things that you should start doing is start building your contractor list. That's one of the things you can ask them is, who have you used that you really liked? You know, and of course you want to start with the plumbers, the electricians, the painters, the roofers, all of that we deal with all the time, but my list includes dog sitters, mechanics, massage, I just added a couple of massage people. Lawn care, oh, absolutely, lawn care, yeah,
It's
house
almost
cleaners.
you and your own Team.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what it is. And so ask the people that you know, love and trust, who they use that they like, you know, and here's the, you know, I'm not looking for A.B. May or Bob Hamilton, you know, that's, you know, if that's who they use, oh, great, you know, whatever, but they don't go on my list. I'm looking for, oh yeah, my brother-in-law Joe is a plumber, and he does all of our stuff. Oh, that's great, that's who I want on my list, and guess who my next phone call is to? Joe the plumber, right? I'm a small business person, Joe, and I understand that you are too. You came highly recommended from, you know, this person, and I would love to help support your business, and I would just hope that maybe you would support mine too.
That's a good way to put that, like, small business, you know, stuff.
Absolutely.
What's hard is working with a client whose family owns it. So she wanted to have.
Sure, well, yeah, they can do, right,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Like they're the most expensive, my seller did not like all their bids, because they're really high.
Of course, of course.
So, anyway.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
And that's what you'll run across, right? Exactly. So, yeah, what Laura was saying was, you know, after I just said something I probably shouldn't have said, you know, in a public arena was,
No,
and
it's
she
fine.
said she was working with someone who was related to the A.B. May family, the family that owns them. So of course, you know, that changes that whole thing. Right, buyers and sellers can use whoever, right? Okay, now I say that, yes, because that's what I consider to be my job in life is to be a connector. However, Lynn Weymouth, our supervising broker, would say, probably shouldn't, right? And she doesn't sell much anymore, but she used to. And, you know, her answer when someone would say, well, who should I use? Who should I call? I don't know. Who do your parents use?
They
You know,
were having checking with their people.
with their own people.
I mean, I will
Right.
say, like, it kind of bit me, because, yeah, I was like thinking I was doing a nice thing and I was getting the appraiser set up and yada, yada. Used to our team, you know, and they were first available, and she didn't really like how they would do it. So, yada, yada. You know what I mean? So, lesson learned,
Right,
provide her with options. I guess I could have set it out, like, what appraiser company. would you like to
Exactly.
do out of town? So,
yeah,
I used to work with, the lady who did the Baby Night commercial.
mhm.
Yeah, I used to work with her, says, yeah, this, and I'm not, you mentioned that.
That is. a-
Yeah. Yep.
Small world.
it is a small world, right? And A.B. May is a big deal here in Kansas City.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's heating and cooling company.
Plumbing.
They do all of them. Kind of-
Yeah.
Kind of like a one-stop.
They
shop.
They have one of the warranties also
Yeah.
that's available.
Yeah.
So, yep, absolutely.
I always been through a process of like buying and buying, so I'm like, I've been really so many.
Yeah. There's so much to it.
Yeah.
Place.
Yeah, it's like a place to learn.
Yeah.
Absolutely is. So,
Yeah, you can buy a house. But
Not right now. Again, it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
But if you're ever looking for a real estate agent.
good job, Amber.
Yeah.
Good job. All right, so still in paragraph D, so I want to finish out this paragraph, then we'll take our break here, but still in paragraph D, it's the parties and it's the disclosure, right? The disclosure of the parties actually is what it all boils down to. So we talked about through lines 134, starting on line 136 is our disclosure that Kansas and Missouri both required that we make these these three statements down here. On line 136, seller or buyer is a licensed real estate agent or salesperson, and check applicable boxes. Seller's licensed in. If we're writing it on behalf of a buyer, we're the agent, usually the agent assisting the buyer, licensee assisting the buyer. That's another conversation or something that should come up in the conversation when you call the listing agent. They absolutely should have it in MLS. That's a law disclosure requirement too. But sometimes they have it kind of buried in stuff, but they should make it perfectly clear to you if they are a licensee as the seller. All right. And here's the other thing. Once it's disclosed, make sure that you are checking the appropriate boxes there, Kansas or Missouri. Chances are, most of us here are licensed in both. And any other state that they have a license. Licensee assisting the buyer. I'm sorry, yes, a license, the buyer is licensed in Kansas, Missouri, or any other state. I don't know what Connecticut's laws are about disclosure. But I do know that Kansas and Missouri require disclosure if we are licensed in Connecticut, if we have a Connecticut license. So whether or not you are in that state, if you are licensed in that state, make sure that you're making the disclosure. Kansas and Missouri require that of us. All right. Then on line 140, licensee assisting the seller is an immediate family member of one party or the other. Or line 142, licensee assisting the buyer is an immediate family member of one party or the other. And the reason for this disclosure is not so much that the states are concerned about us treating our family members better than we would treat other people, but this is because of a possible future financial interest in this property that we might have. Okay, all right. All right, then we'll start then with subparagraph E when we get back from our break. It's 9:57. I'll see you all in 10 minutes. So, all right, so we're back and Olgie did have a question. And her question was, if there's no contingency, if the buyer does need to sell their property, which is what, what kind of what they're asking. Of course, I knew she would come in as soon as I closed the door. So if there's no contingency, would there be an area in the contract that addresses bridge loans, or is that through the lender only? That's a great question, and you answered it yourself. That is absolutely, we don't deal with that in the contract. It's one of those things that we need to know that the buyer has been approved for that bridge loan already, right? It's gotten the pre-approval for that. But no, then we don't address it. And that is one of those things that can help a buyer make a much cleaner offer, a much stronger offer. Contingency offers are being accepted. They're being considered and accepted now, where they weren't, for quite a while there, for a few years. But it is still a weak offer. And the seller has the right to kick that contingency out if they get another offer. So there's a risk on both sides. But yes, a bridge loan, if the buyer can qualify for the bridge loan, is an absolutely better way of doing that if they can do that. And we don't, then there's no contingency. That's right. That's just all part of the loan process. Good question.
Thank you.
All right. And then I'll share screen again. All right. So we got through the disclosure part. The notices, any notice or communication? Okay, I get all these weird things on Zoom here. Required or permitted hereunder may be delivered in person by facsimile. I still think that's hilarious that we still even have that. Anybody here even know what a fax is? I bet that, some of you probably never received or sent a fax. United States Postal Service, courier service, or email to the address set forth in this contract or such other address or numbers as will be furnished in writing by any such party. So that really is kind of an important, and I don't want to make it sound like everything in our contract is important, but this is what establishes that any electronic communication is a valid communication. Text messages count, emails count, voicemails count as communication for us here. When we're requiring signatures, those signatures can be transferred anyway too. But our communication is anything electronic has been determined by courts in Kansas and Missouri. Time is of the essence. I hope you all learned about this one in your pre-license class too. Time is of the essence in the performance of the obligations of the parties under the contract, with the exception of the terms banking days or business days, is used herein. A day is defined as a 24-hour calendar day, 7 days per week. Pardon me?
No, I'll be upset.
Okay, okay, all right, very good, all right. So that's why knowing what your effective date is so important. All of our dates now depend upon what our effective date is. Make sure that you're counting calendar days, all right? And we'll get to that here and how that really works. Electronic transactions, we can get electronic signatures, cyber awareness. We have a cyber protection notice that I suggest that you give to all buyers and sellers. It's here in our contract as well. Just prepare everyone that the hackers out there have gotten very, very, very sophisticated. We are one of the top 2 industries that are hacked the most often because they know that there's a lot of money being transferred here. Make sure that your buyers and sellers are aware that they may get emails that look like they're coming from you. They may look like they're coming from a title company or a lender. Don't click on anything. If there's ever any question about it, call not the number that's in that email, but call another trusted phone number to verify that that's an actual valid email. A lot of wire transfer emails are floating out there about us. All right, we're on page 4 now, paragraph number 4. Just they don't always line up, they just happen to on this one. And we're finally talking about money, right? And we have all of our contract stuff up there, clarifying a lot of terms and all that kind of stuff. Now we're to well, what are we offering for the property? So on line 4, and I'm going to go over this. It's not a really intuitive paragraph here, the way that it works. And it's just because of KCRAR, the way that they've designed it, because some of the other forms in Kansas and Missouri don't do it this way. But we're very specific on the way that the money is dealt with on this, and it's a little confusing until you actually get it. And so we'll go over how that works here, but we have our purchase price. The purchase price for the property is, and this is the number that the buyer is offering. Remember that you can never suggest to a buyer what they offer. It's not your job, right? You can present them a market analysis that tells them what the numbers might tell them. But buyers will ask you, well, what do you think we should offer? Well, right? That,
Always have to put it up on them.
that's not part of our advice and counsel, right? Right, exactly. All right, then we deal with the earnest money. Earnest money will be delivered to the licensee assisting the seller or escrow agent, then blank. And we have, anytime we have a blank here for days or numbers or certain numbers there, we're going to have a default. And so our default here is 3 days. Calendar days, right? Because it's not designated as anything else. So your EMD has to be delivered within 3 days of our effective date. First time our effective date comes into play here. If it's a check, and there are still some buyers out there writing checks, if it's a check, do not trust the buyer to deliver that check. You get it from the buyer and you deliver it. If it's an electronic deposit, that 3 days still applies. Make sure you are reminding them every 15 minutes. Yes, I'm exaggerating just a
I
little
did
bit.
not do that with mine. I mean, it worked out okay, but it was like, I just gave them the info and it was, yeah. I was like, oh, I need to stay on it.
You do, because, and keep reminding them that that's a term of our contract. And must comply with state laws as defined in the earnest money and additional deposits paragraph in the contract. We'll get to that. If earnest money is not delivered during the delivery period, seller may cancel this contract by written notice once the delivery period has ended and prior to delivery of the earnest money. All right. So make sure that your buyer understands that, how important it is that it gets there. So let's pretend that how do these days work from our effective date? Let's say that we have our last signature today on 7/31. And let's say the buyer signed it this morning, one seller signs it at 5:50 this evening, and the other seller doesn't get to it until 9:25 tonight. We have our effective date of 7/31. Our days start counting for everything at midnight. All right, so tomorrow is day 1 of all of our dates. Okay, starts at midnight because because it doesn't matter when they signed it, the time starts at midnight. Then we're still dealing with earnest money here in subparagraph B and the amount of how much earnest money is the buyer putting down. Talked about this just a little bit on Monday. From a seller's perspective, they want as much as possible. Listing agents will tell you it has to be 1%. What they're saying is that the seller probably won't consider your offer unless it's 1%, because we don't even need earnest money to have a valid contract. But most sellers won't consider an offer without it and will tell you how much they want. From a buyer's perspective, make sure your buyer understands this is money at risk. Yes, there are legitimate ways that they can cancel the contract and expect to receive their earnest money back, but remind all parties that everybody has to sign off on the release of that. And I've seen obstinate sellers that wouldn't sign off on the release.
Even if you check it's refundable.
Even if you check if it's refundable,
They
right?
can say, no, I don't want to get it back.
Yeah, they can tie everything up by not signing that. Absolutely. Yep. Yes. Yep.
Can that be fault after that? I mean, can you fight it like the seller doesn't want to sign to give the buyer his earnest money back?
Mm-hmm.
Can that buyer turn and fight it in court?
Oh, of course. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
How successful?
Yeah, that's it too, right? Right. And all kinds of things where, you know, because it all goes into an escrow account, right? Now, most of the time you all probably learned, I'm guessing in your pre-licensed class, that it was the listing broker that has that escrow account. That's how I think, that's how they probably still present it on the test. Most listing brokers don't have escrow accounts anymore. They've turned that responsibility over to a title company, right? But all of the same rules and laws still apply, right? If that money doesn't belong to anyone, once we have an effective contract and it is deposited into an escrow account and no longer belongs to the buyer, certainly doesn't belong to the seller, and it doesn't belong to the broker, doesn't belong to the title company, it's sitting out there in limbo. And so until and unless both parties sign off on the release of that, it can't be released to anyone. Okay. So just make sure that your buyers understand that, because I've seen buyers that wanted to put, a huge earnest deposit down. And that's fine if that's what they want to do. Just make sure that they understand that money is at risk. Okay. All right, and what form? Because in Kansas and Missouri, Kansas specifically says that it has to be in cash unless it's approved by the seller to be in any other form. So our check, electronic transfer, CAT or ACH is there. Other would be if we're accepting a title to a vehicle or jewelry or stocks and bonds or something else of value, because all of that can be earnest deposit too, right? You keep going back to, he's trying to take us out into land. That's really what he's trying to do. I understand that. Right, exactly. Yeah, livestock absolutely could be. Sure. All right. So that's why we designate, because the seller has to approve the form. On line 180, deposited with, MLS is going to tell you who the earnest deposit goes to. It's one of the fields that will not change on MLS. And again, usually, I don't know of any broker now still collects it. Most of the time it's the title company, not the title company that your buyer's going to use, but the title company that the seller's going to use. And then yes, always check one of these two boxes, and I will tell you that 99.9% of the time it's going to be refundable. Please make that refundable. Never, oh gosh, never make earnest deposit out to a seller without checking with your broker first.
Not directly to.
Not directly to the seller. The one big exception to that is on new construction. It's usually going to be made out to the builder, and that is very, very, very common. Builders like it because they're probably going to be making changes and customizing a build job for that particular buyer. And so the sellers the builders taking a risk that, well, if that buyer backs out, now I've got this property that might not be attractive to other people or as attractive to other people. So that's one of the common ones that we would see. But never make one out to a seller other than a builder without checking with your broker, because that becomes could become a problem. Buyer acknowledges that funds payable and held by the seller will not be held subject to the terms of the earnest money and additional deposits paragraph, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Subparagraph C, any additional earnest money. This is if the buyer only has so much cash available right now, but will deliver more when we have an effective date, once everything's signed. Seller may come back and ask for additional earnest deposit. So that's what we would address. We rarely address it here unless it is that buyer that will provide more later on. But it does become something that we deal with on a counteroffer situation. So we always have to refer to what the paragraph we're talking with, and all of those same disclosures and checkboxes there. So on line 196, total amount financed by the buyer. So I know this isn't it. Oh, and I still didn't bring my markers in. So on this first line up here, on line 176, we have our purchase price. Then on line 186, we have our earnest money. Then on line 196, the amount financed by the buyer. You're going to have to do some math here. Even if you're using the form from KCRR and the templates and dot loop that has calculations, you are going to have to determine what this number is. What this number is, the amount financed. What is the loan amount that buyer's getting?
So you take the sale price minus the earnest.
Not yet, not to get that. To get this line or this number on line 196, you figure if the buyer's putting 20% down, you figure 80% of the sales price. If an FHA with minimum down payment, that's going to be 96.5% of the sales price. You have to figure the loan amount here and put that in. This is the one that confuses everybody. And again, it's not real intuitive. Seems a little bit backwards until you get used to it and figure out what they're doing. All right, so the amount financed, the loan amount goes on line 196. On line 200 or 201, the balance of the purchase price. So what now we are going to have, and if you're using the calculations document through KCRAR templates and .loop, it will, once you've put in those other three numbers, it will figure this number for you, which is why to me it's not such a big deal. I mean, if I figure those other three, I might as well figure this fourth one too. So it doesn't really matter which one you use. So now we have what Laura was going for. Now we have the sales price minus the earnest deposit minus the loan amount. So what line 201 is saying to the buyer is, this is what you're going to bring to closing, but we're still not including any of your closing costs. This is basically your down payment minus your earnest deposit. Our contract says that if we get to closing, that both parties agree to release that earnest deposit back to the buyer and it will be applied to their down payment. This gets a little confusing if you're doing a no down payment loan, like a VA or a USDA. You are going to end up with a negative number here. And that kind of throws .loop off a little bit too, to do that. So again, not real intuitive until you figure out what they're doing, right? But we're not including any closing costs here, just the down payment. Then additional seller expenses. Each line is 0 if left blank. So once again, you don't have to address it as NA or 0, just leave it blank. This is what was added, line 206 and 207. Seller compensation to broker assisting the buyer. Seller agrees to pay broker assisting the buyer from seller's funds at closing. This is where we negotiate our commission as the buyer's agent. Our buyer agency agreement says to the buyer, hey, I expect it to be paid 3% of the sales price of the property or whatever. It could be a flat fee, right? But here, and then here's the tricky part of this too, is that on this line, we can't say 3%. This has to be a number.
So you have to figure out what 3% would be,
Exactly.
and that's what's going to be 3% of the purchase price.
Yes, yeah, that's right. No, I thought you were gonna add another word in there. Is it 3% of the gross? Is it 3% of the net? And do you even know what I'm talking about there?
Gross.
Should be. I mean, it doesn't matter. There's no, I mean, that I shouldn't even have said that. So erase that from the record.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter, right? It could be a flat fee. You could be charging your buyer $5,000, right? If you are charging, but it all depends on what your buyer agency agreement says. If your buyer agency agreement says a percentage, which I'm guessing most people still will go that route, then if our sales price should change, this number is going to change too.
Add the numbers on top and it knows what goes where.
That would make life too easy. You're asking for a lot
But
there.
then people will still probably be putting in their own numbers.
Oh, undoubtedly,
Right?
undoubtedly.
Isn't that easy?
Right. So this has not ever been dealt with before in our contract. This is new. And so, you know, you all don't have any bad habits that I need to break. So we're going to have more trouble with the existing agents, right? With the more experienced agents here. So, right,
On this part.
right. So this is where you're going to put that. Just remember, if you are dealing it, because this is all dependent on what your buyer agency agreement says, and nobody else sees that, right? The seller doesn't see that. So just remember, if you are dealing with a percentage, you have to change this if that sales price should change. And there are several different times that sales price might change. It might change while we're negotiating here, right? The seller may come back with a counter offer. Well, if I'm going to pay your $5,000, then I want a higher sales price than you're offering, right? I'll pay it. But because that's the way most sellers, I think most sellers look at things, is that they don't really care what we're asking for here. What they care about is their bottom line. What are they walking away from the table with? right?
Yeah.
So they may ask for a higher sales price. So, and then if after the buyer does their inspections, that's another one of the things that we can do is adjust the sales price rather than ask for repairs. So if that changes, then our commission has to change too, has to be dealt with as well.
That, but you wouldn't change it here, it would be in line for RUC,
Exactly,
right?
exactly, right? Right. All right, so now from here on out, in the rest of this paragraph, we are dealing with something that has always been in our contract for many, many years here. Any additional seller paid costs. In addition to any other costs seller agreed to pay herein, seller agrees to pay other allowable closing costs permitted by the lender and or prepaid items for buyer not to exceed. So this is again why it's very, very, very important when you are working with the buyer. Number one, to do an estimate of closing costs for them before you ever show them a property, show them that they will need additional money over and above their down payment for their loan, if they're getting a loan. Doesn't apply if they're paying cash. And I probably should deal with that up there too, on the sales price stuff. So the number one, they're prepared for it. And number two, you have to provide an estimate of their closing costs on this offer specifically, so that we know if we have to ask the seller for closing costs. Right, so, and then why they call it additional paid costs. Our contract says that the seller is going to pay for any termite treatment if evidence of live termites are found or wood destroying insects. Our contract says that the seller is going to provide the title insurance for the buyer. So the seller's already paying for some things, and this is saying, okay, over and above what you're agreeing to elsewhere in this contract, we're asking for $4,000 for you to pay the buyer's closing costs. And our contract makes it pretty clear, closing costs and prepaid items are all inclusive and lender permitted. I don't know, there used to be some things in certain of the government, federally related loan programs, FHA, and USDA, that they wouldn't allow a buyer to pay for. I don't know of any now, but there may be specific lender programs. If you're working with a local lender who's providing a down payment assistance program, they may have special things like, well, if we're doing this, then the buyer can't pay for, the termite treatment or termite inspection or, whatever. So make sure you're checking with the lender, but for most of our conventional loans and the federally related loans, I don't know of any that are limited. That we would get to then on subparagraph 3 there, any costs not payable by the buyer. So make sure you're checking with the lender on that. So now then down on line 218, we are now totaling all of those. What we're asking them to pay of our compensation, what we're asking them to pay for the seller's closing costs, all show up on line 218. As I said, I should probably deal with a cash offer up here. So when we've got our buyer making a cash offer, we still have our sales price there, and we will certainly have earnest deposit. That's still applicable on a cash transaction. Our amount financed on line 196 would be 0. And our balance of purchase price then would be just the sales price minus the earnest deposit. They don't have to bring any extra money. Down payments only for loans. Oh, and I didn't point it out either here. The top of page 4, even though it's on other pages too. Not only on the very first page are you going to see the KCRAR logo up at the very top left-hand corner. You'll also see on some pages that there's a gray triangle up in the top right-hand corner. That's your little cheat that there's something for you to address on that page.
That's nice.
It is nice, isn't it?
Did our brokers do that too? So that's all of one.
All of the KCRA forms, well, the contract is, I don't know that they've done it on everything else. We used to on our internal forms. I think they might still be there on our listing agreements and buyer agency agreements, but as we're going through some of the changes on those, I'll make sure that we at least talk about it here. Other financing costs. So this is our paragraph G here, starting on line 219. Other things that we hope that you've had the conversation with the buyer about these things. Some of these things are things that the seller needs to be made aware of too, but that there are going to be loan costs over and above the down payment on most type of loan products. FHA mortgage will have MIP, monthly insurance premium. VA will have a funding fee and but FHA also has the upfront premium and USDA has a funding fee. All of those things are costs of the loan that can be rolled into the loan. We're not including any of those in the sales price or what they have to bring to closing, but can be considered to be seller payable closing costs. Also here, and I know this is one that gets glossed over a lot, flood insurance. Buyer agrees to pay for flood insurance if required by the lender. It's been made pretty easy for us in MLS, that we can look now pretty easily on a version of the FEMA flood maps. So you can determine with your buyer if it appears that the property is close to or in a flood zone or floodway. It is not our determination to make. Nobody cares what we think about that property. Nobody cares what the buyer thinks about, whether that property is in there. It's the lender and FEMA that make that decision. So always check the FEMA flood maps are right there in MLS. Very easy for us to check. It's just a tab for you to click on in MLS. And warn the buyer, warn the lender. If the buyer really likes this property, I would make a phone call to the lender and say, it appears on mine that it might be close to or in a flood zone, but obviously, lender, you're the one that's making that decision. And the reason this is such a big deal is because flood insurance is over and above any homeowner's insurance. Flood insurance, depending on how affected the property is, can be very, very, very expensive. It can be prohibitively expensive. And so this is one of those things we need to check into pretty early on, but just making sure that the buyer knows if they're getting a loan, that the lender may require flood insurance. Okay. Then we get to paragraph number 5, closing in possession. So our closing in possession on or before, and we have to put a date in here. Make sure you're looking at the calendar, make sure if the buyer's getting a loan, make sure that you've talked with the lender about how much time the lender needs. We typically think of a 30 to 45 day closing. Sometimes lenders can say, oh, we can get them closed in 21 days. Please don't try to push your lender, even though a lender may tell you that, hey, we just got one closed in 12 days. Please don't push them on that, right? Sometimes if we're flipping from one lender to another, we can sometimes get that, but I'll allow plenty of time. Make sure that you are accommodating any holidays in there, because banks don't work on holidays. So even in the middle, you're going to be delayed by a day or two in there. You certainly can't get your inspections done on holidays, that kind of thing. So make sure that you are looking at a calendar and not setting a Saturday or Sunday, because we can't close on Saturday or Sunday. I would even suggest you stay away from Fridays, especially the last Friday of the month. Everybody wants to close on the last Friday of the month. And title companies get very busy then. All right, so then this is again, not that they're not all important, and I've got to start talking really much faster here, but I do want to talk about this paragraph. Seller will execute and deliver into escrow with the title company or any other closing agent, because it doesn't always have to be a title company. Some lenders close their own loans. We can certainly have an attorney close a loan or close a transaction. Any other closing agent, a general warranty deed or special warranty deed or fiduciary deed of seller is a corporation, association, financial institution, or fiduciary. So general warranty deed, and only under certain circumstances, a special warranty deed. We cannot use this contract if the seller's providing a bargain and sale deed or a tax deed. All right, just bear that in mind. All this, everybody remembers, you all remember all the details about all those deeds, don't you, from your class? Of course you do. And you know why? Because people told you didn't have to remember that stuff, but yet you do, right? Linda's here to tell you to do. And all other documents and funds necessary to satisfy seller's obligations under this contract. Seller's obligations are to provide marketable title and title insurance. On or before the closing date, buyer will execute and deliver into escrow with the title company or other closing agents all documents, including notes, mortgage deeds of trust, and any other documents required by buyer's lenders if buyer's obtaining financing, and funds, including loan proceeds if buyer's obtaining financing, necessary to satisfy buyer's obligations under this contract. So sellers promising to sell and provide marketable title, buyers promising to buy, so they have to bring the funds. Once all of that has happened, closing has happened. Line 248, seller and buyer acknowledge all funds required for closing must be in the forms of cashier's check, wire transfer, other certified funds. Buyers will show up with their personal checkbook and say, oh, well, nobody ever told me that. You know, so make sure that you have told them it has to be in certified funds. You have, the lenders told them, the title companies told them, they just need a selective hearing. Line 251, when all documents and funds have been executed and delivered into escrow with the title company or other closing agent, the closing will be completed. That's our closing, when everyone has fulfilled all of their promises. Seller will deliver possession of the property to buyer on, and we have a blank here, and we do have a default. Our default is 5 p.m. on the closing date. If it's a vacant property, leave that as it is. Don't mess with anything. Even if the buyer is going to close at 10 o'clock in the morning and start moving in at noon, who's going to complain, right? If it's a vacant property. If it is an occupied property, make sure the seller can vacate the property on closing day. It's very common here in Kansas City for us to allow the seller a day or two to collect their funds so that they can move on, right? Very common for a day or two. It becomes kind of a tricky situation. Whose insurance is covering who and what on those 1 or 2 days in there, right? So we have to deal with all of that stuff, but it's very common. It is not so common in other parts of the country. So sometimes people moving here from other parts of the country are taken aback by that, right? No, they have to be out as of closing, right? So line 256, buyer must not occupy the property or place personal property in or on it prior to completion of the closing and disbursement or availability of sales proceeds, if any, unless otherwise agreed upon in writing in the buyer and the seller. Never, ever, 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 ever allow a buyer to move stuff in early. On either, I mean, whether you're assisting the buyer or not, or assisting the seller. And you will be asked, hey, we just want to move some stuff into the garage, some boxes into the garage. No, no, no. Because again, whose insurance covers it? And of course, Murphy's Law, if the buyer moves something in early, something's going to happen. So just don't allow, just don't allow it.
Unless you have we move stuff in their own, in our house. They allow, like, we had it in writing, like, they put it in writing. Buyers are allowed to.
Okay,
possession early.
Okay.
They already have possession before.
So we got possession of the garage 2 weeks prior and because we were doing the same thing, we were selling our house already.
Uh-huh.
So you had it right in the contract.
Yeah, so the seller allowed us.
Yeah.
to-
we do have a special form
Okay.
called occupancy prior to closing, right? Exactly. And it deals with insurance and all of that. So, all right.
But it's
Sorry.
also tricky-
No,
It's also tricky because if the loan doesn't go through, then like,
Yeah, I
because
know, that was-
because it's not closed till it's closed. right?
Exactly.
Yeah, they took the sellers took a big risk.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, pretty uncommon.
Absolutely. Both parties are taking a risk,
Yeah.
right?
True.
Yeah, you're right. The seller is, but then also the seller can hold that property
Yeah.
hostage.
Yeah.
And
as
I'll
well.
give you access.
Exactly.
You can kind of go vice versa too, because like I was in a position where the closing date was a certain day, but they wanted us to leave out there ahead of time, so the buyer could move in.
On closing date,
Yeah, yeah, but it was actually a little bit early.
Early.
It was asking for the permission, when we wouldn't have written down, but it was just a verbal thing.
uh-huh,
We had already had the house that we wanted to move into too, so it's like, okay, cool.
Huh?
We gone, you know.
okay, from now on,
Yeah.
has to be in writing, using the special forms, right? But yeah, no, you know, I'm glad that you all bring these things up because it does have, these things happen all the time. There are rules and regulations in real estate and our contract says one thing, but if anyone that takes a class with me knows that I say anything is that there's exceptions to every rule, right? There more than one way of doing things in real estate, but make sure that everything's in writing and agreed to by all parties. Always, always. All right. The appraised value contingency, because I need to be moving through here a little faster than I have been. So appraised value contingency, I'm sure everyone remembers learning in your pre-license class that if the, and a cash buyer can get an appraisal too, and all of this applies even if that is the case. But if an appraisal is done on a property and it comes in lower than the sales price and the buyer's getting a loan, which number is the lender going to lend on?
the price for the lower number.
The lower of the two, right? If the appraisal comes in higher, they're still gonna loan just on the sales price, right? So always the lower of the two. So if our appraisal comes in low, we have a set time period here in our contract. If I haven't made it clear, even though we have a default behind all of our dates and timeframes in here, those are all negotiable terms, right? We can allow more than 3 days for the earnest deposit to be delivered. It has to still be within the 5 or 10 days, depending on which state the property's in, that it is deposited, that's negotiable. Here we have our negotiable appraisal contingency here. So our contract says that we have blank calendar days from the effective date of the contract within the inspection period. And when we get to that, we'll see that that's a 10-day default to get the appraisal done. Then on the next paragraph, that the final appraised value of the property is determined by a buyer's lender, or if a cash sale buyer's appraisal is not equal to or greater than purchase price, buyer will notify the seller in writing within, and our default is 5 calendar days, attaching a copy of the appraisal report. Then once that's delivered to the seller, we have 5 calendar days to negotiate what's going to happen. Is the seller going to agree to sell for that lower price? Is the seller going to say, no, you agreed to pay this, I expect you to pay the difference? If the buyer can pay that difference in cash, right? If they have the ability to. If not, maybe they agree on a number between the two. It all depends on the market and what's going on in that seller's brain and the ability of the buyer. All right, sale contingency. If we're getting close to now the terms of the financial terms for our buyer. Paragraph number 7, this contract is not contingent upon the sale or closing of buyer's property. You have to check one of these 2 boxes if that's the case. If they got a bridge loan, as Olgie asked earlier, and we're not making contingent, we check this box. If we are saying no, the buyer has to sell and close on their current property, we check the box on line 290 and then also attach the contingency documents. Then we get to the financial terms. If it's a cash transaction, we check the box on line 296. One of those 2 boxes has to be checked, 296 or 299. If it's a cash transaction, if the buyer is not providing proof of funds with the offer, our contract says that they have 5 calendar days from the effective date of the contract to provide that proof of funds. Proof of funds is either a copy of their bank accounts with their account numbers whited out or blacked out, of course, but showing that there's sufficient funds in the bank accounts, or a letter from the bank officer or a financial manager that says that the buyer has sufficient funds to meet their obligations of the contract. All right, then we have our notification to the seller, the terms of the loan that the buyer, if the buyer's getting a loan, the terms of the loan the buyer's getting. Type of financing on line 311 will be an owner-occupied loan or an investment loan. For most sellers, it probably doesn't matter whether it's an investment loan or an owner-occupied loan. There are some differences in the requirements for both. Investment loans require higher down payment, sometimes proof of income from that property, that kind of thing. So a little bit there, but I like the fact that this question is in there, although it shouldn't matter to a seller, but sometimes it does. Whether they're selling to a person that's going to live in the property or an investor who's going to rent the property.
What about if they're an Airbnb? Would that be invested too?
That would be investor too, because that would be the kind of loan that they're getting, right? We're also letting the seller know here, whether it's a conventional loan, an FHA, a VA, a USDA, other would be either hard money that we're getting from another source other than a bank. Seller financing is what we could put in there too, or actually 321 was added last year and I always forget about that. Owner financing, seller financing, a local down payment assistance program. Most of them will fit into one of those other categories, but some of them don't. So it's very fair for the seller to know what kind of loan the buyer's getting. This one, the fixed rate, adjustable rate, or interest only loan, again, because the qualifications are different on those kinds of things. An adjustable rate mortgage is usually a little easier for a buyer to qualify for. So that's why that's there, an indication to the seller. An interest only loan may be a little harder for a buyer to qualify for. So just a few little clues in there for the seller. I know agents just kind of gloss over this page, but there's some pretty important information that can be gleaned from here.
So is it better to have, is it better to have a interest only? What's the best? What would be the cleanest, like if you're sending a claim?
Fixed rate or adjustable rate. Interest only, again, usually is attached more to an investment type property. Those are short-term loans, so again, it can be an indication, but they are harder to qualify for because it requires a balloon payment at the end. And the lenders are going to be looking at the source of that balloon payment. So, all right, yeah, and interest only is kind of an indication it's going to be some kind of investment. Line 329, the amortization period, is this a 15-year note, a 30-year note, 20-year note, whatever? Principal amount or LTV? I prefer to go with LTV, loan to value. If it's a 20% down payment, our LTV is 80/20. If it's an FHA with minimum down payment, it's 96.6/3.5. The loan amount shown as a ratio to the down payment. I prefer to use LTV because once again, if we are changing the terms and a counter offer or later on, we don't have to worry about changing that, right? If we put the loan amount in there, which is perfectly fine, but if we put the loan amount in there, if our purchase price ever changes, we have to address that change here as well. It's just, for me, it makes it a little cleaner if we put the LTV in, but putting the loan amount in is just fine too. Oh, and I do like to point out too, you will 99.999% of the time be working with just the first column over here where it says primary loan. Secondary loans, I hope, permanently go away from our, from our business and from our lives, and certainly from our forums. This is if the buyer's getting a loan for the down payment. And that was a big thing back in the 90s and 2000s. And it caused a lot of problems, right? That's one of the things that caused our meltdown in 2008. So I hope they go away. So that's why you see primary loan and secondary loan here. And then interest rate not exceeding. This is a protection for the buyer. And this is maybe information that you'll get on the pre-approval letter, maybe not. You might, but this is certainly a conversation that you have to have with the buyer or the loan officer. So with interest rates being as volatile as they are right now, if the buyer's pre-approval letter says that this is 7.25% interest, and make sure that is that the highest interest that the buyer can pay. If interest rates go up to 7.5, is the buyer no longer qualified, right? So that's a good protection for the buyer here, that they either can't or don't want to pay higher than a certain amount. Protection for them, however, it weakens their offer a little bit, right? What makes a stronger offer is if we can check the box on line 338, that the buyer will pay whatever interest rate it is at the day of closing. And make sure that they are able to do that before you check that box. Loan application on line 349. Buyer agrees to authorize lender to perform all required services. We check the box on line 353. Please don't be out showing a buyer that you don't have a pre-approval letter for. That's a waste of your time, can be a waste of your time. So you'll be checking the box on line 353 that they do have a pre-approval letter. On the blank on line 354, you will put the institution's name. You can also include the loan officer's name, but it's really the institution that we're looking for here. Please don't ever check the box on line 361 because you're not out there showing buyers that properties for whom you do not have a pre-approval letter. If you do, that's what you would do there too, because then they're saying that you have 5 days to get them into and get a pre-approval letter. The loan approval, buyer agrees to make a good faith effort to obtain a commitment for the loan within, and we have our 45-day default here. It can be, whatever.
Margin,
Okay.
because I'm doing orientation after this,
Okay.
and it's gonna be in the Brookside room, so if you haven't done launch program orientation, or watch the video, or wanna do it in person with me because you have questions, And I'm also giving out the MREA books
There you go.
and the orientation booklets too.
Okay.
Right now.
I'll give you, yeah, after this.
Yep, we're
give you
wrapping up.
about 5-10 minutes so you can have a break. 'Cause you've been in here a long time. Your heads, your
Uh-huh.
brains have been like exploding. I know that.
Okay, all right, and the Brookside Room's right across the hallway over here, all right, for those of you that don't know, okay. All right, I'd like to talk about this, and yes, we're running out of time. We only got through, a few pages here. But any questions that you all have, I will send everyone here, if you want it, I will send you a copy of this training form so that you see all of the changes here, okay. But I do like to talk about this, the loan approval, because the buyer agrees to make a good faith effort to obtain a commitment for the loans within blank calendar days. We have our 45 days here. If you set your closing for 30, it's going to default back to that 30 days. Or within 5 days prior to closing. Our commitment letter is one of those things that most agents don't ask for, rarely get, but it's one of the most important documents that what's the most important document? The deed. You have to guess what Linda's thinking sometimes, but right? Everything you do, from the minute you get up in the morning and you start thinking about making your lead generation calls, everything we do revolves around a deed being transferred from one party to another, right? Has anybody here ever seen, other than those of you that own property, have you ever seen a deed in a transaction? Please ask for it, right? That's why we wake up every morning, right? And you won't, I mean, it's one of those many papers that shuffled, amongst all the people at a closing. Just ask the closing agent, hey, can I have a copy of that deed? They will absolutely accommodate you, right? That's why we're here, right? Okay, so loan commitment letter, I'm gonna put as number 3 on that list. Because first is the deed, second is the title report, title policy. And number 3 is the loan commitment letter if the buyer's getting a loan. And the reason it's so important in our world is because that is the only proof that we have a ready, willing, and able buyer. And we only get paid if we have provided a ready, willing, and able buyer. That's in our listing agreement. That's in our co-op agreement if we're the ones working with the buyers, that's in our co-op agreement with the other brokers in the Kansas City metro area. Otherwise, we have a ready and willing buyer. Anybody that writes an offer is ready and willing, but the able has to be proven for us to say that we have earned our commission. All right, well, we didn't get very far. And those of you, right, because Linda likes to talk, but you all ask great questions, and I'm not going to pick up here next month. I'm going to start the whole process over again. But this is what happens when I have people in person, and I love it. I think it's great. So I'm going to send everyone that's participated today on Zoom, and here's our check-in. I'll start it here. If you want to check in and let Kristen know that you were here. Jody, I know you were here. Olgie and Autumn, so I make notes. I really should hold that QR code up, but I know and Kristen will know that you were here. So everyone that participated here today will get a copy of this training form. Please look over it. I'm not going to be at Wednesday Night Warriors tonight. I have a prior commitment. Or I might be here for just a few minutes, but if anybody is attending Wednesday Night Warriors tonight and you have any questions about contracts, at any point, that's what Wednesday Night Warriors is all about, making sure that you all are prepared with whatever you feel you need. Reach out to me via text or email. I'm happy to address any concerns or questions that anybody has. Again, my phone number 913-219-2289. All right. That's it. See you all. Thank you. And well, here I will for those of you. So everyone here can leave, but if those of you hanging out with me here on Zoom, I will show the QR code here for a few minutes. If you want to snap that. To let Kristen know you were here. I see I've got another chat thing here. Oh, he's saying thanks. So, all right. Thank you all for joining me. Let me know if I can be of help. All right. Talk to you all soon. Thanks, Doug.